The following is a production of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, a program of the Washington State Library, a division of the Office of the Secretary of State.
Welcome to another edition of Literary News. My name is Ward Ryder, and we're here in the studios of the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, where I'm very happy to welcome author Ned Hayes to our studio. He's the author of The Eagle Tree, a story about a teenager with autism who struggles to navigate and express himself within the complex world around him. While grappling with family, social, and even legal challenges, he pursues an increasingly dangerous quest to climb and ultimately protect a gigantic ponderosa pine tree near his home in Olympia, Washington. Ned Hayes is not only the author of The Eagle Tree, but also its novelette sequel, Holy Trinity, as well as the novels Coeur d'Alene Waters, Sinful Folk, and the upcoming The Real World of Jasper Hunter. So Ned, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me here, Ward.
Absolutely. It's funny, this morning, I guess I should have made this connection earlier, but this morning I was going over some of the things I wanted to talk about with you. And I checked the news and saw that there is a 16-year-old Swedish girl on the autistic spectrum named Greta Thunberg.
Right.
Recently in the headlines, delivering an impassioned speech on climate change at the United Nations Climate Summit. And at one point in The Eagle Tree, our 14-year-old protagonist, March Wong, also on the spectrum, he gives an impassioned public commentary at a session of the Olympia City Council, during which he argues against the clearing of trees in the local woods that includes his ponderosa pine, with which he's infatuated.
And it's wonderful to have this in the news because I feel like people who are on the spectrum often have a very direct way of seeing things. Yes. And I think those voices are incredibly valuable. My friend Steve Silberman, in fact, wrote an article for Vox.com, and he talks about the fact that Greta Thunberg's activism is not in spite of her autism, but in fact is because of it.
And she said it was her superpower.
Yes.
I saw.
Yeah. And I think it's problematic if we put people on a pedestal or we say, people who are on the spectrum or have a certain disability are therefore gifted in some fashion. So I think that can be problematic, but instead I think it's important to value every human voice and every lived experience. So I love that March's voice is out there and that Greta's voice is being privileged too.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about March's voice. That was one of the interesting things to me in this book. His method of speech, I would call it deceptively flat. I noticed as I progressed through the book that through uses of repetition and other rhetorical devices, it gets a rhythmic, almost poetic quality that slowly and subtly reveals his emotion and development in ways that you don't normally see in books. And I'm wondering if that was your intent and how you went about creating his voice.
Right. Well, I have the experience of having taught kids on the spectrum and taught kids who have different varieties of atypical expression. Yes. And so being able to have that experience, I think, has exposed me to different ways of communicating. So there isn't kind of one way of communicating or using language. It's great that you notice that, but I think often we make assumptions about people based on either physical behavior or physical disability or even just basic differences in how people's faces look or how their voices sound. And that's not to say that their voices, to repeat my earlier point, are not equally human and equally valuable. But I do feel like March, because he's 14, he grows. He changes through the course of the book. And I want readers to see that. So you picked up on one aspect that I use. You might notice that early on in the novel, March doesn't use metaphors. He throws those away and says, I'm just interested in the facts. And yet,
they're not true to him. Some things are not true.
Exactly. He wants something that's just factual, just truthful in his expression. And yet by the end of the book, you'll notice that he is actually using some metaphors. Yes. So he's decided to adapt those as a way of telling his story. People are not fixed in place. I guess that's my point. It doesn't have to be locked. People can change. And that's part of what I'm showing with March. Not that he's changing away from who he is, but he's allowing his version of the universe to expand.
Was it difficult trying to make him relatable to readers?
Yes. In fact, I had an editor tell me that I should rewrite the book from the point of view of the mother. So, fortunately, not the editor who published the book. She loved it. But I did get that feedback that they found March difficult to access. And I think that was part of the point of the book, that you're inside of March's perspective. And so there's vast amounts of information that March doesn't care about, that you never find out about in the book. So I'm sure there's I know there's a whole story from his mom's point of view. And there are pieces of information that are missing from March's narrative that I think somebody who was more neurotypical might actually care about. And March doesn't, so you don't hear about it.
No, he's only interested in his pursuits.
Singularly focused.
He loves climbing trees, and as a climber, as a youth, I get that, and I love how, for him though, it's everything.
Right,
and
right.
How,
and the small anecdote there.
Yes.
The editor who actually did publish this, Carmen Johnson of Little A Books, she actually reached out to me and said, should you put a little bit more into the book about tree climbing? Because she said that she had never climbed a tree. Because I think she was born and raised in New York City. You can't climb the trees in Central Park. Right, and so I really feel lucky that myself, my friends, my children have been able to grow up climbing trees in the Northwest. They're everywhere here. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the book is such a love letter to trees in general. Not in some traditional hippie sense, but goes from the esoteric to the religious to the very scientific. And by the end, you see trees as entities of a lot of layers, I think. And only someone like March, it seems, is able to bring that out in a way.
Right. Steve Silberman called March in the book like a 14-year-old Walt Whitman with autism, which I think was really lovely. Also, I've connected with Richard Powers, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning Overstory novel, and he's currently reading The Eagle Tree. I think we both have a passion for telling the stories of nature and telling the stories of trees, and I think March was a vehicle for that.
I've learned that you audio dictated a lot of the book. Was that
I did.
Was that March's voice in particular, or was that other characters as well? Was it
the voice that I mostly audio dictated was March. I found it easier to audio dictate him than to write him on the page because it felt like it flowed more. And when March sees something, he wants to see every factual aspect of it. And so being able to really drill into that in an audio way made it just flow. I use modern technology to do that, and I know that a lot of people who are blind or have limited sight use the same text. So it made sense to me to connect with someone who has differences in his expression. Use another technology as well, and it really worked.
I was just struck, since we are on the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, that there's a symmetry to how you created that character and then how we are now expressing it back outwards. Did you form the character to an extent as you were dictating, or was there a fully formed version of March from the get-go?
That's a good question. Years ago, when I did teach a variety of kids with different expressions, I was really struck by this one young man who had an affinity for nature. And he wasn't exactly like March. He also had an affinity for electronics, which March does not have. But it struck me that the worst place to put a kid who was obsessed with trees would be here, because trees are everywhere and he'd be climbing everything. And frankly, it's kind of a novelist trick. An obsessed character makes a really good narrator. So once I got into March's shoes and saw the world through his eyes, the whole story kind of came to me in a flash, and I just had to keep writing it. So I wrote the first draft of the novel in about a month flat, and then kept revising for a few months. But the novel was almost entirely complete at the time I started writing, at least in my own head. So it was one of those serendipitous moments of just conceiving the whole thing like a diamond that you had to unpack from the surrounding coal.
You mentioned obsessed. Another thing that struck me with the book was the mother. I personally am glad that it wasn't written from her perspective. I was so emotionally upset for her a lot, and it was almost because we were not, with the first-person limited narration, I was not part of her thoughts, but we could see her in the background, and my imagination just filled in all the gaps of her story. And I was really connected. And knowing that March loves to find clever loopholes in the rules given to him by authority figures, sometimes he even outright breaks things. But we see him almost helpless to resist those urges sometimes when he's so focused. So the book really brings to light how some of the challenges of parenting an autistic child. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. I can't imagine being a parent and with the unpredictability of a child who will simply not do what you want and will even put themselves in danger in the March's case. What is that like for parents, and what can they do?
I feel like part of the reason that March's father left the picture was that, sorry, I'm giving away part of the book, but part of the reason March's father left the picture was that it was difficult for him. It was too difficult. And that's not explicit in the book, but I think you can read between the lines and find some of that. And yeah, his mother has a difficult burden in helping March to reach adulthood intact, because March does do dangerous things and does things that he feels are best for him, but he's not aware of the consequences, or if he is aware, they are inconsequential for him. Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for the mother. As a plot moment, I needed a moment in the novel where March was taken away from his home. So I actually sat down with a friend of mine who works for the Department of Juvenile Services, and I asked what would cause that moment to happen. And so we investigated different possibilities. And it turns out there's one thing that a parent says in the presence of a designated reporter. If a parent says, I can't do this, or I'm not capable of caring for this child, then a police officer or other people are required by law to report that. And so that can lead to a 72-hour hold. It can lead to other actions being taken place. But it was very interesting to me to know that she had to be pushed to the point where she would say that, because she's gone through so much that she doesn't say that easily. And so at the moment that she does say that, March has imperiled his life. He's damaged property. There's a lot that's happened. And so for her to say that, she was kind of at her wit's end. And I think maybe they both needed a break.
That could be true. How much research did you do? I've noticed in your other works, there's clearly research that's been done too. Are you drawn to areas where you will need to find out a lot of additional information for the completion of a work?
For each book that I write, I end up with a complete kind of shelf on my bookshelf of books that are related to the area or are resources to me to learn more about the subject. And I love writing a novel because I get to inhabit a new world and learn about that world. In fact, my wife laughed at me when I started writing this book because I couldn't tell a sycamore apart from a hemlock. I was not by nature a tree person. And yet, by the end of the book, of course, I became a mini expert on trees because March was. So I'm just looking at the back of the resources, and yeah, there's about 3 pages of resources. There are 10 to 12 books that I looked into on trees and tree ecosystems, including Northwest Trees and The Tree Climber's Companion, and Maria Mudruth's beautiful book, Rare Bird, about the marbled murrelet. Then I also read up on neurodiverse experiences because I felt it was incredibly important to get that right. And so I talked to people with autism and spent time with them. And one thing that's important to note is that March is never identified by himself or his mother as autistic in this book. He never names it. He's named as a human being. So that's important for the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, for other people on the spectrum, because their experience is a human experience. It's not something that is different in a meaningless way. It's equally human.
One difficult topic with inside neurodiversity seems to be the question of how much society needs to change to accommodate legitimate ways, but also taking into account the fact that some people with autism do need extra care.
Right. And there are people with autism who are nonverbal, and also people with autism who are just going day to day. Not everybody with autism is a genius. Not everybody who is blind is a superhero. Not everybody who's neurotypical or has no overt physical disabilities is mentally healthy. We all face our own struggles. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, absolutely. I learned so much about autism through the book. For example, that March's relationship to pain is different from my relationship to pain.
Right.
When he feels pain, he is aware of it, but doesn't seem to care as much about it. If his focus is elsewhere, pain doesn't mean much for him. It's not an inhibiting factor
Right.
for him. So I found information like that really interesting. What other aspects of autism were really important for you to get across to the reader? What did you want the readers to understand about autism and being autistic?
Well, again, it goes back to I wanted March to be a human being that you had to encounter as a person rather than as a label. So I didn't want to ever label him as autistic in the book, and I didn't do that. Or label his felt experience in his body as being atypical. And so instead, as you did, a reader gets into his experience and just is embodied there and has to understand, oh, this is how it is for him. So I'm saying all that to point out that not everything that he experiences is a feature of autism. Some of it is just the way he is, you know?
I was wondering about that too. When you create a character, part of whose identity, especially for the purposes of the book, is autism. How do you balance giving the reader information, helping them understand this human, and making March unique? How did you strike that balance? How is he unique beyond his autism? What makes him March and not another teenager with autism?
Well, by the same token, March is Asian American, and yet that's not a defining characteristic of who he is, and neither is the autism. I think his voice and his experience with trees is pretty defining for him, but his lack of neurotypical affect, his voice, his Asian Americanness, his Olympianness, since he's from Olympia, his Americanness. I mean, he's very American in the ways that he approaches the world. All of those aren't really labels that capture him entirely. So what I wanted to do in this novel was allow him to escape the labels and to take action, because often people who are different are constrained. And having him break out of that and be able to actually take action in the world and make a difference, that was the trick I had to pull off, because March's behavior could be so disruptive that he could be constrained. I mean, he was on that 72-hour psychiatric hold. He could have been removed from the community. And so I had to find that balance of how do I get someone who's oppositional to society in some ways and yet is loved? How do I give him a voice, and how do I make his action make a difference? So that was the trick. It wasn't the trick of how do I make him fit in. That wasn't my goal. My goal was to ensure that he had a voice at the table.
I noticed beyond March, or in March's journey to navigate his surroundings and his goals, that not only March but the book itself started to explore disparate topics like science and religion and ultimately bring them together. And I noticed that also in the sequel, the novelette Holy Trinity, that you pursue it further. And I found that very fascinating. Was it March is obsessed by truth? Was it your goal to find kind of a truth, a reconciliation between these two things which are often kept apart in society or at odds with each other?
I think that's a healthy tension between our ideas of mythos or of spiritual truth versus factual truth. And I think that tension adds something to the story. March, like all of us, has to grapple with that tension and try to resolve it. And I love that March states overtly he doesn't believe in God. He's an atheist, and yet, he goes to church because his mom does, And so I love that he is bringing together science and faith. And I think all too often the faith aspect or the spiritual aspect is left out of our discussion of common topics in the news or of science. And I think that's to our detriment. I think when we're able to really bring those two aspects of the human experience together, I think we are enriched by that. And so I hope that March's perspective is deeper because of that emphasis on a larger story. Are we part of something that moves beyond us?
I got a little bit of like a pantheist feel from the book, where where nature, all of our surroundings, and the glory of them, as expressed by Ilsa, the character who's a minister.
Yes, and she's based on a real church in Olympia. The United Churches is a real church, and there were several pastors there who Ilsa is loosely based on. One of them is here in Seattle now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So just briefly back to that approach, what's interesting is that if you look back at church history and theology, there's actually been a real embrace of nature as an aspect of the divine throughout Christian history, and of
Yes.
course even more so in some other traditions such as Buddhism.
Mhm.
And I'm very attracted to the writing of a theologian named Sally McFay, who I quote in this novel, who said, "What if we imagined that the natural world was the body of God?
Yes.
How would we treat it?"
Interesting
yeah.
perspective. You have a rather storied background, I'm gathering. You seem to have a career that's led you, I believe, from journalism to the tech world. And I'm wondering not only how you have time to create
Yeah.
books like this, but how your career and interests have yielded all the different subjects in your books.
Well, that's a long, long story. But I am not obsessed with trees alone. I'm very obsessed with storytelling. And so I have found ways to tell stories in the technology world, working for Microsoft and working for Intel, and tell stories in my novels as well. And I've also done a lot of theater. I do theater production and direction and playwriting. And I guess I'm a pretty obsessed person because I wake up early in the morning between 4:30 and 5 and write novels before work, and then go to my day job, and then get off work and read more books. So,
In fact, you're the founder of an arts publication.
well, that has an interesting story. The Eagle Tree was unexpectedly a national bestseller. And so I took the royalties from the Eagle Tree and actually started an arts magazine in Olympia.
They're linked.
They're totally linked. Started the arts magazine, Oli Arts, in Olympia as a way to give back to the community, because I felt like the community had blessed me so much and had given me so much, not just with this novel, but in terms of my community there, that I wanted to give back to that community.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And the magazine still exists and is still doing very well.
Oh, excellent. Who are authors who have influenced or inspired you?
In the acknowledgments of this book, I don't know if you read the acknowledgments aloud in your...
We do.
Okay, great.
We do.
Well, at the very end, I state that I have posted by my desk a series of rejection letters from publishers. And one of my favorites is this one, which was a rejection for A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean. And the rejection reads, "These stories have trees in them." That was a rejection. Norman MacLean is an inspiration to me. I love his work. He only wrote 2 complete books, but they're small masterpieces. Pete Dexter is a writer I admire, and Pete Dexter wrote a wonderful review of Norman MacLean's Young Men and Fire, which was really profound. And then, of course, Annie Dillard and a number of other authors. Recently, I've been reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Suzanne Clark, which is a historical novel. And what I love about it is that it captures the style and period of that writing, and yet it's a novel about a historical world with a bit of magic injected. So I like reading across the spectrum of books.
Can you also briefly tell us a little bit about your other novels? Because they're
Sure.
also quite different from the Eagle Tree.
Yes. So I wrote Coeur d'Alene Waters. I started it in a number of years ago when I was in college, when I was living near Coeur d'Alene. I wrote a few notes, and then about 20 years later picked up the pen and wrote the novel that were based on those notes. So that's Coeur d'Alene Waters. That's a murder mystery. And then I wrote a historical novel called Sinful Folk, which is a medieval novel. So I have a whole shelf of medieval books.
Of course.
And including some Middle English books. I learned how to read some Middle English and read a lot of Chaucer. And so that novel is through the voice of a medieval woman, which I could really go off the deep end because all the medieval women are dead. So they aren't going to criticize you for getting it wrong. But contemporary 14-year-olds who have a touch of Asperger's are definitely alive and with us and will tell me if I get it wrong. So I had to be a lot more careful with the Eagle Tree. And I'm currently, as you mentioned, working on The Real World of Jasper Hunter, which is set in our world slightly ahead, so maybe 5-10 years from now, where virtual reality has become a present thing, and my character is the only person he knows who can't go online. So in a way, he's disabled, but the rest of the world has a different way of seeing. So it's another book that focuses on a character who's outside the norm, but the norm has shifted.
And it's potentially your first work to make technology an integral
Right,
part
right.
of
It's
the
the
work as well.
first book that I can actually bring my technical background to bear.
I see.
So that's been fun.
I noticed you've given presentations on the intersection, it seems, of ethics and technology.
Yes.
Is that something that is informing your upcoming work?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's always on my mind because I think we are increasingly in a world where technology, the ideas behind technology are preeminent, and we are considering them meritorious because they are technology rather than thinking about the actual consequences. Just a sidebar here. Neil Postman, a number of years ago, wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which he talks about the way that there have been different dystopias that people have thought about, like 1984 or Brave New World or Fahrenheit 451, different ways the world could go wrong. And Brave New World, for example, shows a world that is not ruled by a dictator, but it's ruled by distraction. It's ruled by people who just want to be amused. And his concern in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is that we are headed that direction. And I think when you look at people who are clicking on every single YouTube video or are unable to put down their phones or are unable to really read or listen to a book, we're beginning to approach that world where people don't think deeply. They just click through the headlines and they think they know the news instead of actually reading deeply and thinking deeply. And so one of my hopes is to avoid that.
I wanted to finish with at least a mention of the setting of the eagle tree, which is, of course, in our area,
Right.
in your backyard, it seems, the Pacific Northwest. And in the book, it's also, I think, a little educational for people who don't live in the Pacific
Right.
Northwest, too.
So the eagle tree is definitely set in a very real world Olympia, Washington. And we took pains when we were editing this to ensure that the street directions that March walks on are precisely accurate. And so if you go to Olympia and you try to follow March's path, everything will work except for one aspect. The huge tree called the eagle tree that I had placed in LBA Park is not there. It's actually in private land over by Evergreen State College. And I moved it across town because the owners of the land that own the vast tree that is called the eagle tree did not want people coming on their property to see it.
So this tree exists.
This tree exists. It's not actually a ponderosa pine, but it does exist. And part of the reason the owners were concerned about it is that people from Evergreen State College, who have a lot of interest in spirituality and nature, have camped often at its roots in order to kind of worship the tree, and therefore have the root ball is slightly damaged.
From that.
Just from camping there. And so I respected their wish, and that's why I moved in the novel. I moved the tree to a public location, and I'm not going to reveal the private location. But what's lovely about it is the tree actually does exist. It's called the eagle tree because eagles do.
Even by name.
Yes,
Eagle
yes,
tree.
even by name. If you talk to the owners, oh yeah, the whole neighborhood knows the name of it. And because eagles do make nests at the top of it. And there have also been marbled murrelets in the woods around that tree. So
March finds one at the top of it.
March does
This
find
proves
one.
important for
And-
the plot.
Right, and I feel like I'll make a small connection. If you think about the marbled murrelet and you think about March, they are very connected because both of them don't have some of the kind of emotional protections that we would think of. Like a bird, you think, oh, they'll have a nest, they'll have a nice little mother feeding them, all that kind of good stuff, right? And you think of a kid and you think, oh, well, they'll be engaging in all the antics of kids and they'll have lots of friends and all of this. And neither the bird or March fit that stereotype. Marbled murrelets are laid as a bare egg on a tree limb that projects into nowhere, and then they eventually find their way back to the ocean from tens of miles inland. And nobody knows how they do that, but they do it. Similarly, March is kind of on his own for a lot of the novel, and his mother loves him tremendously, but she can't be there for everything. So that was a nice connection to draw.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we say farewell?
Well, I appreciate people who have read this book and have reached out to me. I really appreciate the readership, and I appreciate that people believe that I did not get it wrong, because that was my main concern, to ensure that March's voice was properly represented. Thank you for reading the novel, and thank you for letting me know how it went for you.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for being here today. We've been in the studio today with Ned Hayes. Thanks for listening to another edition of Literary News here at the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library.